Hello everyone, and welcome to the first section of our composition lecture. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you guys about was this idea of lines. So lines are a basic element of art composition, right? It's one of the things, lines and shapes, that we compose our images of, right? So there are some, basically, over the centuries of usage, they have become defined, right? So I'll just quickly go through this list for you. Horizontal lines, because they sort of remind us of the horizon, we think of connection to earth, rest. And then vertical lines, they're going straight up away from the earth. We can think of it as connecting us to the heavens. Obviously height. And what's important to remember is that these lines, there's a start and an ending to a line, and your eye tends to follow from one end to the other. So it's a way of visually leading someone's eye around an image or a space. So diagonal lines are another example of line, and they are considered more energetic, right, and really convey movement and this idea of direction and energy. If you have vertical and horizontal lines that intersect, that's a very stable kind of line, like a grid pattern. Curves tend to convey an emotional state, right? So if they're very deep curves, can be very confusing, highly emotional states or turbulence. If they are curves that are softer, that can convey sensuality and sort of a relaxed space. Think of how gardens are designed. If they are geometrically shaped versus if they have soft flowing lines, what kind of feeling does that give you? The final category isn't really a line, it's implied, right? So it's a line that's not there, but you act like it is because you're following a well-known visual cue. For example, if you see a character with their finger pointing, you are going to tend to follow, your eye is going to tend to follow that the finger, right? So that line isn't really there, but it's implying it for you to follow. Similarly, elements of the composition might not actually form a real line, but they might kind of imply a diagonal or a curved line, even though there isn't really one drawn there. So let's take a look at some examples in the art world. Now, these are two-dimensional works of art, but these are things that can be used within a 3D environment, right? So here we're looking at the death of Socrates, right? He's an important philosopher, so very, full of high thoughts and very eloquent. And here we see him as he's drunk his poison, and he's going to die, but he does not seem cowed by it, right? In fact, his body is pretty much a perfect vertical, right? And then his leg is laying out in a horizontal direction, not so perfect as his body, right? And then his hand as well, right? So he's forming these almost right angles, and he's mimicking, or he's following the wall behind him, right? Because we have those blocks and we have that grid pattern, and there he is. He's this voice of reason, of rationality, which is what straight and horizontal lines, particularly if they're crisscrossed, or intersected, give that implication. Now you'll notice that the figures on the other side of him are looking down. They have more curved lines, particularly the figure right here, right? If we look up, we can see here he's very up and down, very vertical. We go here and we have a nice curve, right? That gives you a sense of emotion. You can imagine that this character is crying. Here's another type of composition. So using these curved lines, and we often associate curved lines with emotion or the feminine, okay? And so what we're looking at is when Delilah cuts Samson's hair. It's this Bible story, and of course she's gotten him, he's passed out and asleep, and here she is in this sensuous curved composition, and then we see these people looking over, right? And here's an implied line, because you're going to follow where they're all looking. And where are they all looking? Down here at the point of interest. this helps, the artist is basically kind of making sure that the viewers are going to look in at that cutting of the hair. And then we also have these guards who are sort of peeping through the door. And so if we look at the overall composition, it's first of all kind of diagonal. It's sweeping across the image, giving it energy. And then it's also got this sort of intertwined, sensuous, curvy forms that keep, as you go up this diagonal, you hit these figures with their implied lines that bring you right back down here, right? So it tends to keep you in this loop. So this is another example where we're going to look at curves, but this one they're mixing them, okay? So here we have Jupiter, and he's the male god, right? And he is very much got our vertical geometric male shape, right? He's strong, his arm is forming a right angle, but we see this other figure is that the feminine and in very much a curved, more submissive or supplicating state, right? So again, showing the masculine in this geometric shape and the feminine in this soft curved form. Very, very typical in art to convey these things. All right, so this isn't really line, but it's kind of important to talk about here, and the term is aerial, or also sometimes called atmospheric perspective. And this is a famous Leonardo da Vinci painting, and what we're looking at here is we see these figures right in the foreground, and you'll notice that at the front of the painting the colors are kind of warm, right? And this red really pops. And as you recede back into space, well, first of all, a couple of things happen. How do you know? I mean, this is a two-dimensional painting. How do you know you're going back in space? Well, first of all, the size gets smaller of the rocks, but also the colors shift to like a blue, to a cool sort of bluish gray, which is typical of how things look when they're far away. There's a color shift. Also, things as they go farther away become fuzzier, right? They become less distinct. So he's kind of faking that. Now, in Unreal, you can set that up to happen by itself, but it's still something you can play around with, is how color can manipulate if things are forward or background, right? So things that are warmer tend to seem closer to you, and things that are cooler can seem to be farther away, just depending on, if they're next to each other in certain instances. Okay, well, I'll pick up on the next talk section with layers.